The wind moved like it had teeth, carving its way through the frozen valleys of Maple Fall, Vermont, biting through pine and shutter and bone. Snow hadn't fallen so much as hardened into glass across the landscape, turning everything it touched into something cold, fragile, and strangely still. At 2:12 a.m., a black SUV lost traction along Highway 49 and struck the guardrail with a sound like the earth tearing at its own seams. The impact twisted metal against pine bark and launched the vehicle off the embankment, flipping twice before crashing into a half-frozen ditch. The air filled with the brief, high-pitched ring of shattered glass, then the deeper roar of fire as fuel lines snapped like arteries. Flames licked up through the undercarriage. Inside, the windshield fractured, the passenger airbag failed to deploy, and the rear window exploded outward from within. Minutes passed, then silence. No sirens, no headlights, only wind. Then came the horse. He moved like shadow-given muscle. A wild Mustang, black as the tree trunks behind him, with a scorched patch across his flank and frozen blood streaked along his left foreleg. His breath came out in heavy clouds, but his eyes held nothing of panic, only direction, purpose. Clenched in the shredded saddle still barely clinging to his back was a fragment of a child's blanket, soaked in something dark, the edges burned crisp. He found the road, then followed the scent. Not just blood, something else, something known. 3 miles away, Dr. Evelyn Rhodes startled awake to the low, rhythmic pounding outside her farmhouse. At first, she thought it was just wind rattling a loose panel, but the sound came again, deliberate, heavy, and unmistakably alive. She pulled on a flannel coat and boots, grabbed her flashlight, and opened the front door into the freezing dark. The Mustang stood at the edge of her gravel path, steam curling from his nose. He didn't flinch under the beam of light, didn't stomp or flee, just watched her. Evelyn stepped down cautiously. She hadn't seen a free-roaming horse this close to town in years, and never one that looked like it had crawled through fire. Then she saw the blanket. Something clenched behind her ribs, the burnt cotton, the tiny star print, the way it was knotted in the cracked leather of a saddle never made for long rides. She looked into the animal's eyes and saw something terrifyingly human, urgency. He turned and walked 3 paces, then paused and looked back. She followed. They passed fences, half-buried mailboxes, a snowdrift where a mailbox flag still stood up like a warning. The air howled low and mean. After nearly a mile of trudging through knee-deep white, Evelyn caught the glow of orange just beyond the tree line. Her boots crunched over glass and gravel as she emerged at the crash site. The SUV lay at an angle, tilted into a ditch. One side had caved inward. Steam hissed from what remained of the radiator. The windshield had spidered over. The metal around the frame curled back like peeled skin. Flames flickered along the rear, choked mostly by snow, but threatening. And then she heard it. Not a scream, not a cry. A thump, weak, rhythmic, like something or someone trying to push their way out. Evelyn ran to the vehicle, yanked on the crumpled rear door. It didn't budge. She dropped to her knees, flashlight in hand, angling for a line of sight through the broken glass. A small figure curled beneath the back seat. A child. She shouted for help, knowing no one would hear. Her fingers bled against the twisted handle, but finally, the door gave way with a groan. Smoke wafted from the interior. Evelyn reached in, arm shaking from effort and cold, and pulled the girl free. The child's lips were blue, fingers scraped raw, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She clung not to Evelyn, but to the approaching horse. Blaze stepped closer. The girl looked up, eyes wide and distant, and without a word, pressed her forehead to his. He lowered his neck. No fear, no hesitation, just recognition. A reunion Evelyn did not understand. Behind them, the fire flared again. Evelyn grabbed the girl, wrapped her coat tight around them both, and turned toward the road. Blaze followed, walking slowly now, hooves silent against the frost. Later, under the floodlights of the county fire unit and the blinking reds of state patrol, Evelyn stood beside the girl, wrapped in thermal blankets. The Mustang stood nearby. No lid, no fence, just present, watching. When asked who the child was, Evelyn had no answer. She simply looked at the horse and said, "He found her, and I think he's the only reason she's still alive." That night, after the child was taken to Maple Fall Medical Center and the remains of the SUV extinguished, one of the troopers checked the highway camera feed. The time-stamped footage jumped, glitched. Just before the explosion, one frame stood out. A tall figure in a long coat, walking away from the crash, head down, hands gloved. No prints, no ID, no reason, only questions, and the faint echo of hooves disappearing into snow. The frost hadn't melted from the edges of the windows when the sun rose over Maple Fall the next morning. Snow lay like a hush over the world, blanketing the sharp details of what had happened only hours before. But inside the small medical wing of the town's emergency shelter, nothing felt quiet. The air held a charge like a question waiting for an answer no one wanted to say aloud. The girl hadn't spoken. Wrapped in thermal blankets, her small frame barely dented the cot where she lay. A nurse had coaxed her into sipping warm broth, but her eyes rarely moved from the glass pane separating her from the outside, where Blaze stood tethered in the snow, his breath forming thick clouds that rose and vanished. He never looked away from the window, never blinked when others passed by, and every time someone opened the door to the room, the girl flinched unless she saw the silhouette of the horse waiting beyond the frost. Dr. Evelyn Rhodes stayed near her, not because protocol demanded it, but because something deeper compelled her. A tether that had no name, only weight. The girl, temporarily registered as Jane Doe, wore a single object on her. A plastic, hospital-style wristband with no hospital name, only a long string of alphanumeric code and the letters HG23. Rhodes had seen it once before. During her last month in Boston, in a set of restricted veterinary data files her husband had sent before disappearing. Now, looking at the girl's silent form, Evelyn didn't need confirmation. She felt it. This was no orphan, no accident of bad roads and worse luck. This was fallout from something larger, darker. In a different wing of the clinic, Nate Callahan stirred beneath a wool blanket. The man had regained consciousness twice, once muttering something about a fire, another time mumbling, "Don't let them take her." He never asked for water, never questioned where he was, only asked, once quietly, if the horse made it. Sheriff Quinn Harper had already been to the scene. She stood over the wreckage of the SUV now, arms crossed beneath her department-issued coat. The VN had been filed off, the tags forged. The inside reeked of bleach and blood. Her deputy, Tom Bridges, stepped out from the snow-covered ditch holding a duffel bag retrieved from behind a frozen embankment. "There's no registration," he said. "Just burner phones, cash, maps with hand-drawn markings." Quinn didn't respond. Her eyes were on a patch of snow that hadn't fully iced over, despite the cold. Heat lingers when something burns from the inside out. The back windshield had shattered from within, not from impact. Like someone or something had broken out. Back in the clinic, Blaze remained still as stone. The vet assistant had tried to move him to the stable, but the Mustang refused to step further than the glass. When the girl was moved to a different room for scans, Blaze followed the stretcher from outside, tracking it with every pace. He neighed only once low and guttural when an intern touched the girl's wrist without warning. The sound stopped every other conversation in the room. "That's not behavior," Evelyn muttered. "That's training." She stayed up that night studying the wristband. Eventually, she opened an encrypted drive hidden in the lining of her luggage, the last thing her husband had given her before vanishing. Inside were files she'd never dared read until now. The phrase Project Hearthguard appeared on the third line of the first document. Quinn arrived not long after, her boots still dusted with snow, jaw tight from hours of silence. She placed a manila folder on the kitchen table. "That SUV," she said. "It crossed through 3 restricted zones in the last 4 weeks, all flagged as off-limits for environmental hazard control. But not a single checkpoint shows who was driving." "Environmental?" Evelyn raised a brow. "Only on paper," Quinn said. "My old partner worked biosecurity, said it's what they stamp on sites that got shut down for experiments that went too far." Quinn thumbed through her notes. "You remember Felix Vane?" "From Genios?" Evelyn asked, sitting up straighter. "He's back. His face showed up on hospital security 2 hours ago, just standing outside the ER bay window, watching her." Evelyn's stomach turned. "You think it's connected?" "I don't believe in coincidence anymore," Quinn said. "Not since my first corpse in a burned-out lab was tagged undetermined due to biological decomposition." Blaze neighed again, that night short, sharp, and unnatural. Evelyn opened the door, stepping out onto the porch with her flashlight. Snow swirled in the wind, but Blaze didn't look away from the tree line. His ears were back, body tense. A single set of boot prints trailed up to the edge of the property, then vanished. When Quinn came the next morning, she brought news. The vehicle's GPS had been disabled manually, not digitally. Wires clipped, module removed, like someone knew exactly what they were doing. Nate Callahan finally spoke, his voice rough from fever and silence. "There was another one." Quinn leaned in. "Another what?" "Another child," he said, eyes distant. "There were 2. Evelyn felt the chill even through her coat. "Where's the other?" "I don't know," Nate whispered. "But the fire, it wasn't the first time. We were supposed to deliver them to the launch site. But they changed the plan. They wanted one gone, the other reset." Blaze whinnied from outside, ears flicking as if the name had been spoken on the wind. The girl stirred in her cot, eyes fluttering, and for the first time since the crash, she whispered just one word, barely audible. "Blaze." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, of things unspoken, of truths half-remembered, of memories not yet safe enough to resurface. But it was a beginning. And beginnings are all the more powerful when they come from fire and frost, from silence and survival, from a girl with no name and a horse who never forgot. Blaze didn't sleep that night, not even when the winds calmed, not when the embers of Evelyn's stove dulled to ash. He stood outside the barn, snow caught in his mane, breath rising in steady bursts into the brittle air. His hooves shifted every few minutes, always scanning, always listening. And when the coyotes called in the distance, he didn't flinch. He remembered sounds like that from fences topped with floodlights, from the steel corridors of places that didn't smell like grass or hay. Inside the cabin, Clover curled up beneath a patchwork quilt, one hand still clutching the braided leather string Evelyn had looped loosely around Blaze's bridle. The girl hadn't spoken, not once. But she followed Blaze's presence the way seeds follow light, quiet, instinctual, sure. Evelyn kept to the corner of the room, flipping through the government medical directories and flagged case files Deputy Quinn had slipped to her in a plain manila envelope. Most pages were redacted. Black bars like scars across the names of physicians, researchers, facility addresses. One document stood out, a memo marked Project Hearth Guard Internal Review. It contained only one line beneath the header. Phase 3 protocols terminated. Remaining assets classified. Clover was one of them. By morning, Quinn pulled into the yard in her state-issued SUV, tires hissing over packed snow. She carried 2 thermoses and a narrow envelope. Evelyn didn't need to ask what was in it. Quinn nodded grimly and laid the envelope flat on the kitchen table. "I had a friend in D.C. run a deeper scan on Clover's bracelet," she said. "It's not just medical metadata. It's a genetic imprint marker, military grade, pre-registered." Evelyn swallowed. She was cataloged. "She was designed," Quinn corrected, softer now. "And Blaze?" She gestured to the Mustang who stood watch beneath the frost-framed barn window. "I took blood," Evelyn said. "There's an old transponder buried near the scapula. Government issue. His skin's grown over most of it, but the serial still pings Sentinel Equine Unit 9A. That's not civilian, that's wartime-level training." Blaze was more than a survivor. He was a witness. And deep inside him, where no one could reach but the girl clinging to his side, he remembered everything. Later that afternoon, Clover picked up a crayon soft green and began drawing on the brown butcher paper Evelyn laid across the table. She didn't speak, didn't look up, but her hand moved fast and sure. First came thick gray walls, then a rectangular window, no bigger than a license plate, with metal crossbars, a metal cot, a camera in the upper corner, and next to the cot a box, a cage. No door, beneath it, in careful, clumsy block letters she wrote X-23. Evelyn didn't move. Quinn leaned in closer, her voice barely above a breath. X-23 was the internal code for Test Series 7. That wasn't supposed to exist outside the agency. "Maybe it didn't," Evelyn replied, "but she does." Clover kept drawing. One figure after another, people in white suits with mirrored faceplates, no eyes, no mouths, just voids. And then, in one corner, a long shape, 4 legs, a muzzle, a blaze mark on the face. Quinn looked out the window. She remembers the horse. That night, Nate Callahan woke from his sedated sleep, gasping for air. His arms flailed as though he were underwater. Evelyn calmed him, whispered low, and eventually he stilled. "I saw fire," he murmured, "glass breaking, screaming." Then a pause. "The girl?" "The other girl." Evelyn stiffened. "There was another?" He nodded slowly. "Twins, but not biological, matched constructs. One didn't make it out." He gripped the edge of the couch, breath catching in his throat. Blaze tried to pull her. She got caught in the gate. Quinn paced slowly near the stove. "So there were 2 subjects. Clover is the survivor." "She wasn't supposed to be," Nate rasped. "We were told they wouldn't feel pain, that they weren't real. But that wasn't true." His voice broke there. As snow fell heavier over the roof, Evelyn sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly. "Why did you run, Nate?" He looked her dead in the eye. "Because I saw them cry." The truth arrived in fragments hard to trust, harder to deny. Clover, it seemed, had been part of an experiment that never made it into the public records. Blaze had once belonged to the security detail stationed at the Hearthguard Research Annex, where animals were used not only for defense, but also for emotional regulation monitoring trauma responses in genetically modified children. But something went wrong. A containment breach. A fire. And one of the handlers, Abigail Rye, allegedly smuggled out the twins with Nate's help. One didn't survive the escape, but Blaze, trained to protect primary assets, had followed orders not from commands, but memory. He'd run through smoke and gunfire to bring one child out. Now, that same horse stood under Evelyn's barn rafters, his eyes on the wind like he was waiting for history to arrive again. In the following days, as Quinn tried to reach Homeland Security only to find encrypted roadblocks, Evelyn began preparing a fallback plan. She restocked the emergency saddlebags, refilled the woodpile, taught Clover how to hold the reins, how to balance without stirrups. Blaze stood still for all of it. Not because he'd been broken in, but because he chose to remember. And in the far-off quiet of the Vermont wilderness, something stirred in the dark, an engine far too silent, tires leaving no trail in the snow. Evelyn knew it before she saw it, and Blaze, he felt it in his bones. The past wasn't done with them. Snow still clung to the pines like soot-white ash when Blaze stopped beneath the broken timber line, his breath fogging the frozen air in short, sharp plumes. His flanks rose and fell unevenly, dark fur laced with frost, but his eyes never left the trail ahead. Beneath his hooves lay the remains of what had once been a ranger outpost, now little more than a collapsed roof, scorched beams, and half-buried debris softened by time and silence. Nate called it a ruin. Evelyn called it a grave. But Blaze, somehow, had always known the way. They arrived just before dusk. Evelyn's gloved hands trembled as she swept snow from a cracked generator casing beside the stone wall. Quinn Harper followed, dragging a sealed tactical bag with quiet urgency. And Clover, small, silent Clover, remained half hidden in the wool blanket Evelyn had wrapped her in, her small hands clutching Blaze's mane like it was a lifeline. He stood still for her, unmoving, patient, always watching. They made shelter in what was left of the rear cabin. The roof there had only partially collapsed, and Nate, with hands that remembered more than his mind did, managed to secure a makeshift door using the old water tank and 2 strips of firewood. The stove was beyond repair, but Evelyn found an emergency burner beneath the floorboards and coaxed it to life with a bit of fuel and 1 spark. Heat came slowly, like forgiveness. Enough to melt the edge of the cold, not enough to erase it. Later that night, as Clover slept curled against Blaze's side, Evelyn found the recorder. It had been wedged beneath a half-burnt cabinet in the back closet. A portable digital recorder marked only by a red sticker and a faint engraving, Rye A. She turned it over in her hands, hesitated, then pressed play. The voice that came through was soft, fractured, female. If something goes wrong, follow the horse. He remembers what we can't afford to forget. Then static, a pause, and the faintest echo of someone sobbing before the file ended. Evelyn looked up slowly, the air in her lungs caught like frost. Abigail Rye, a name she hadn't heard since the whispered articles on Project Hearthguard were buried 2 years ago. Not retracted buried, no citations, no witnesses, just a memory now housed inside an animal that couldn't speak but never forgot. They didn't sleep much that night. By morning, Quinn's phone showed a flagged alert. A system ping in the background, someone had tried to access her encrypted report on the vehicle's license plate. But the metadata had been wiped, government-level scrubbing. It wasn't just sabotage. It was someone inside the state system, deep enough to erase entire trails. She didn't tell the others right away. Instead, she walked to the edge of the clearing, stared out across the tree line, and whispered a prayer into the wind. Not for safety, but for time. That evening, Blaze began to pace. It started with a twitch of his left ear, then the slow, deliberate steps across the frosted soil. His hooves barely made sound, but his tension bled into the others. Clover noticed first. She rose without a word and followed him to the tree line, where he froze and sniffed once hard. Then again. Then he backed up slowly, nudging her behind him. Evelyn saw it next. A shimmer of movement in the branches, too straight, too calculated. The first dart hit Blaze in the haunch. He jerked, stumbled, then steadied himself. Evelyn shouted. Quinn pulled her sidearm from under her coat and fired into the trees. Nate tackled Clover to the ground and shielded her with his body as a drone buzzed into view, low and scanning. Another dart, then silence. Blaze didn't fall. Not at first. He turned, eyes locked on Clover's, then gave one massive breath like clearing the weight from his lungs and bolted. He didn't run from danger. He ran through it. Clover ran after him, but Nate grabbed her and tossed her into the sled Blaze had once hauled. He threw the emergency gear in next, strapped it down, and shouted something Evelyn couldn't hear over the drone's high-pitched whine. Blaze circled back, his body sluggish now, legs faltering. But he reached the sled, lowered himself, and waited. Nate climbed in behind Clover and snapped the reins, not that he needed to. Blaze moved on instinct. Quinn and Evelyn held the line. The men came fast, no insignia, dressed in tactical black with faces obscured by cold-weather masks. They didn't ask questions. They opened fire with darts and tasers, trying to subdue without killing, but Quinn knew their type. She fired 3 rounds, 2 warnings, and 1 direct, and watched the lead attacker collapse, convulsing. Evelyn tossed the second flare as Blaze vanished into the woods, sled behind him. She didn't need to see where he went. She already knew. The only place left with a signal strong enough to call for help, the abandoned fire watchtower 2 miles east. Nate would find it. Blaze would remember. As the attackers swarmed, Quinn reached for the satellite beacon on her belt and triggered the emergency transmission coded, locked, untraceable. One burst of data, launched to a frequency only a few in the Witness Protection Division still recognized. And then they ran. Back inside the ruin, Evelyn hit the failsafe on the backup generator. The detonation wasn't enough to kill, just enough to erase. Flame bloomed through the snow like old memory catching fire. The past could no longer be buried. It was burning its way out. Somewhere, beyond the ridge, Blaze pulled through snowdrifts with blood pooling at his left side. His eyes locked forward. Behind him, Nate held Clover close. Her hands were shaking, but her face remained steady. She wasn't crying, she was remembering, and that, Evelyn knew, was the beginning of everything. The storm that had haunted Maple Fall for weeks finally broke just before dawn. It didn't go out with a roar, but with a hush, the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. The clouds thinned, the wind softened, and the snow, once heavy and punishing, lay quiet as ash. But peace hadn't arrived. Not yet. A half-mile beyond the last marked trail, where pine shadows grew long and the earth sloped into forgotten ridgelines, the lights of an unmarked vehicle flickered once, then died. Inside, 3 men adjusted their gloves, slid silencers onto their weapons, and checked thermal maps one last time. They were hired hands, but well compensated. The orders were clear: recover the child and eliminate any variables. Blaze, the Mustang, was now classified as 1. In the clearing below, the cabin Evelyn and Nate had reinforced over the last 2 days stood like a war-weary survivor, weathered and unremarkable. Its windows had been blacked out with wool blankets, the chimney pipe sealed until nightfall. Clover slept curled beside a portable heater in the loft, her breath rising in soft bursts against the chilled air. Her drawings still lined the walls, maps of places no child should remember, sketches of cages, shadows, a white room with no doors. Blaze stood outside beneath the eaves. His body bore scars not just of ice and fire, but of memory. The makeshift halter Evelyn fashioned for him was frayed at the edges, rubbed smooth from use. He had not slept in 2 nights, but he remained still listening, watching. Inside, Nate kept his hand close to the rifle Evelyn had taught him to handle. Quinn crouched near the door, tracing lines on a topo map lit by a red flashlight. There was only one way out if it came to that, and it would. They all knew it. The encrypted ping sent from Quinn's device had been received, but help wouldn't arrive in time to stop what was already moving through the dark. It happened fast. A rustle at the tree line, then the crack of snow under boots. Nate shifted, but Blaze had already moved, ears pinned, nostrils flaring. Without a sound, he galloped out of cover, hooves finding purchase on frozen earth like a ghost from another war. His body collided with the first intruder before the man could raise his rifle, knocking him into the trunk of a spruce. The second aimed for the door, but Quinn had it covered. A flash, a single suppressed shot. The man went down, clutching his leg. Screaming, muted by the snow. The third ran. But he didn't get far. Blaze circled wide, cutting off the path, herding him back toward the clearing like an avenger with a memory longer than vengeance. When the man tripped, Blaze reared once, hooves kicking snow and dirt and heat back into a frozen world. The intruder dropped his weapon. He was done. Then came the sound no one expected. A low whine overhead. A drone. Quinn's breath caught as it hovered, scanning. Then a pop-a flare from the tree line, followed by another. Shadows emerged from the brush uniforms without insignia, faces weathered and focused. One of them raised a hand toward the cabin and called out a phrase no one had said in years. Lantern Corps. We're the ones who remember. The men were former Hearthguard scientists, handlers, medics ghosts who'd gone underground after the program collapsed. They were the reason a few survivors had made it out. Quinn lowered her rifle. Nate exhaled and stepped onto the porch as Blaze trotted back toward the door, mane slick with frost, shoulders heaving. Evelyn reached out, brushing ice from his flanks. You walked through fire, she whispered, and still came back. The agents moved quickly. The injured were restrained. Clover was carried, still wrapped in wool and warmth, into a safer vehicle. Before sunrise, Felix Vane was found along a secondary route, attempting to flee. He didn't resist, not really. He smiled when they took him, the kind of smile that knows the war isn't over just because a battle ends. Later that week, his confession would stun the nation. Clover had been the first of her kind to survive full genomic inoculation against synthetic viruses. She wasn't just rare, she was unprecedented, and she had been destined for a laboratory auction in Geneva. But none of that mattered now. In a quiet hospital near Lake James, Clover slept beside Blaze, who refused to leave her room. Evelyn sat nearby, her hand on a file she never expected to carry, the legal petition for Nate Callahan to be appointed Clover's guardian. He had no memory of her origins, but that no longer mattered. He had carried her through fire, into ice, and back again. That counted for more than blood ever could. The media picked up the story. Footage of Blaze at the hospital spread across the country. A Mustang that guarded a child. A girl with no name who survived because a horse remembered. 6 months later, a center opened in eastern Oregon, the Wildlight Foundation. It wasn't large, but its pastures stretched wide. There were children there who didn't know how to speak without flinching, and horses that didn't need language to understand. Clover helped train the new arrivals. She had found her voice not in words, but in motion, in trust, in the slow, healing rhythm of hooves on earth. One spring evening, Blaze stood watch over the pasture as Clover, now taller and steadier, rode bareback beneath the fading sun. Her laughter echoed across the fields. From the porch, Nate sat with Evelyn and Quinn, watching without needing to say anything. The fire that had almost taken everything was behind them now, but the memory of it had forged something that could never be burned away. Blaze turned toward the house once, ears twitching, tail still. Then he returned his gaze to the girl galloping into the light. He remembered, and that was enough.